Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
George, welcome to the CTA podcast.
Lovely to be here. Thanks.
It's great to have you. George, you have been like a phenom for the last couple of years. You've come across basically every single one of my social media feeds, anything ranging from Instagram to YouTube to most recently LinkedIn, I'd say, once we got connected. And you've been in the space of men's advocacy for the last couple of years, being the founder of TheTinMen. And I'm so curious, just, how did you find yourself in this space? How did you get started? And what is it that you do?
Well, it was a lot of different things. So what I do is I talk about men and boys in a kind, progressive way. I try to speak about men and boys advocacy on the left, but outside of the feminist framework. So quite a small crowd of us. And yeah, I have an evidence-based, non-partisan, progressive view of men and boys that talks about everything from domestic and sexual violence, right down to homelessness, drug addiction, male suicide, mental health, loneliness, education. So obviously looking to like boys, bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, fathers, incarceration. Like you think of it, I've done it. Like there's so much to say because there's so few people talking about it. So there's a lot to do. So I'm 1,000 posts in now, more than actually. So, and I've still really only scratched the surface, to be honest. But how it started, TheTinMen was originally just a pseudonym I would use because I didn't want to use my full name. I still don't use my full name. But I wanted to engage in conversations online about some of the missing pieces in gender equality, the ugly side of gender equality, I call it, which is men and boys. So there'd be a post on domestic violence and it would say, X amount of women are abused each year. And I would be in the comments, like in good faith, asking like 30 to 40% of domestic violence victims are men. I'm not seeing any mention of them here or any of your posts. You're supposed to be a feminist, which is about gender equality. I'm not seeing it. Are we going to talk about male victims of abuse, or are we going to pretend that it's just women that are impacted? And I would ask that in like good faith, like genuinely like wanting to have a conversation about it. And then I was just told, this isn't about you and go set up your own space or start your own conversation. So that's what I did. And it's called TheTinMen. And now 5 years later, I'm reaching 1 million or so people every month, 60 or 70, maybe 80,000 followers combined across different platforms. And it's been a real experience. It's been a real learning experience. I feel like I blow my mind every single day with some new facts that I find. And now I'm getting a bit more like clout now, where I can call out some of the big boys in the spaces, a lot of the big charities that I seem to take a swing at. And it's been really good fun.
And you said that originally you were inhabiting feminist spaces and really just trying to ask in good faith what was going on in terms of gender disparities and like really trying to have a constructive dialogue, and that just wasn't happening.
I was a feminist. I mean, I wouldn't like go around telling people, but if someone had asked me, would you consider, I'd be like, of course, yeah, why not? I'm a feminist. Only because then I thought it was just a synonym for gender equality, which I've now learned is not necessarily true. But I've done loads for women and girls as a feminist. I spent 8 nights and 7 days sleeping on the streets of London to raise money and awareness for abused women, in the attempt to open a bakery to basically employ women that have been trafficked and abused and are homeless, to get them off the streets and give them like an honest day's work. And it all fell apart basically, that did, because when it got quite big on the news, they saw these two men, me and another guy, doing these things for women and girls, and then a lot of people couldn't handle the fact that it was two men doing it. So a lot of people were tweeting us like, this guy, two white guys, what do these two good-looking white guys know about women? And I was like, well, thanks for the compliment, first of all. And not very much, if I'm honest, but we do know how to get the attention of the media. Can we work together? And then the backlash went on and on and on. And eventually we gave away all the money that we'd raised for the bakery, and the bakery never happened. So straight away, that like little flags like that, I was like, I'm literally spending a week on the streets homeless to raise the money for women. No, I don't know anything about what it's like to be abused woman, but I'm trying my best, and that's not good enough. And that was the beginning. That was one of many stories that led me down the road, which I'm now on, where I just don't consider myself a feminist. I don't think I care any less about women and girls by not calling myself a feminist. And I find it quite liberating. So yeah.
Yeah. When do you think that paradigm kind of shifted? It seems like, yeah, when you brought up kind of the definition of feminist, when I think about it traditionally, I do think about equality between the genders. But then there seems to be over the last couple of years this cultural shift. I mean, you're describing even trying to raise money for women on and getting backlash for it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Well,
hard to imagine. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's certainly gotten worse recently, but I
Mhm.
mean, there's been problematic strands of feminism right back to the very beginning. Like if you're looking at the suffragettes, who I guess are the OG feminists, the ones that were essentially campaigning for women's right to vote, they were horrendous people. A lot of them, like Emmeline Pankhurst, was a terrorist. Like she planted bombs, set fires, people died as a result of their protesting. One of my bits of trivia is that feminists invented the letter bomb, which is kind of
The
interesting.
letter bomb.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so thanks for that. And they were, a lot of them, including Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter, were like prominent members of the Order of the White Feather, who would basically go around and actively shame unenlisted men into going to war. So they'd give men the white feather, indicating cowardice. So they'd find a man on the street during World War One, and if he wasn't wearing like military garb, he would get a white feather saying, "You're a coward. You should be fighting. You should be giving your life for this country." And they would give him to boys, and they would give him to men that had already been like shot or whatever, come back traumatized, and they would get another feather. And loads of prominent feminists were part of that. And I think it's such a horrible thing to do, to shame men and even boys more so into going and giving up their lives. And that went right back. And the suffragettes weren't all good. They were pretty horrendous, some of the stuff they did. They never talked about the fact that men also couldn't vote, that the vast majority, well, the majority of men couldn't vote in those times either. That's been erased from the history books. And they certainly weren't campaigning for men's right to vote. It was only about women. So yeah, I think the problem of radical feminism has gotten better, or gotten worse, sorry, but it didn't start, it's not a recent phenomenon. It's been part of the movement from the beginning, as far as I can tell.
It almost sounds like you're describing somebody going out and handing out a scarlet letter, but just for bravery and it almost reminds me, and I wonder what you think about this of Warren Farrell's claims around disposability when it comes to
Mm.
men. This notion that this almost side strain of feminism was always kind of involved in the movement. I think of the first person that comes to me in my mind is Valerie Solanas with the Society of Cutting Up Men and the Scum Manifesto, which if you can
Oh
get
my
through
God.
that and stomach it, you're brave in my book because it's not an easy read from an emotional standpoint. But what I'm hearing you say is it goes even further back than
Yeah.
Valerie Solanas. Uh-huh.
I mean, Valerie Solanas is a special breed of feminine. I mean, she is really the worst of the worst. I have that book somewhere. I confiscated it actually. I'm all for like reading, being able to read whatever you want. But I work at a very prestigious arts university part time as a lecturer. And one of my co-lecturers, who was a feminist, was giving it out, like recommending it to students. And I was like, "Can I have a look at that?" I knew exactly what it was, and I was like, I'm just gonna take that. And
Yeah, maybe not.
it's
Maybe
right
not
there.
this.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's horrendous. And people are like, "Oh, it's satire." It's not fucking satire. And people, "Oh, she's a radical. It's not popular." But that book's been like transcribed into about a dozen different languages, and it's been exerted in so many feminist anthologies, and it's seen quite heavily as a piece of quite important feminist literature. And it's like, it's not, that isn't just some one singular radical feminist. There's loads like her, and horrendous. I mean, Warren Farrell was a great example of someone a bit like me, who was, in his day, he was the world's leading male feminist, like a wonderful man. I consider him a friend. And he did so much for women and girls, set up so many women's groups, was such an amazing advocate for women as a feminist. He was and still is the only man ever to be elected 3 times to the board of directors for the National Organization for Women in New York. And he basically was a big advocate of fathers, or well, both parents being equally important in the lives of children, which is quite right. And he found out the National Organization for Women, which is the largest feminist organization in the world, they were basically explicitly advocating against fathers having equal rights to their children. And he just couldn't believe that these people that he considered the guardians of gender equality were pushing for the complete opposite of that. They were pushing for fathers to be seen as second-class parents in the eyes of the law. So that obviously started a big argument. He was thrown out. So was Karen DeCrow, who was the president of the National Organization for Women. She sided with Warren. She was like, "No, we need fathers and mothers. Mothers are not more important. Neither are fathers. Equally important. A child needs both parents." And she was turfed out as well. So there you have like two world leading feminists thrown out of the biggest feminist organization in the world simply for standing up for gender equality in terms of equal parental rights. And in America, fathers still don't have equal parental rights, and the National Organization for Women still campaign against fathers to get it. So a sordid history. Like they did it in Florida, but that's been overturned. But they're still doing it. It's still going on right now.
What do you make of that intention? What do you make of the motivation there?
I mean, I, they just don't want to give up what they have. Like in terms of privilege, it's a two-way street. There's privileges for women and privileges for men, and they don't want to give up privilege. They want mothers to be seen as the first and most important parent. They don't want to share custody of children with fathers, and a lot of it is just down to money. Like another interesting story. I don't know if you know of Erin Pitsey,
Not
who
familiar.
she was a pioneer in the domestic violence industry. She wrote the first book in the world on domestic violence in 1970, and she opened the first refuge in the world for women in 1971. And there was no money for domestic violence. There's very little now, and there's nothing then. So what she did, she squatted in buildings. So she would squat in different houses, bring women in, then move to the next one, bring women in, move to the next one. She took over like literally whole streets all over the UK, a whole hotel she took over. Like thousands of women came to her. Like, an absolute pioneer. No one could ever question how much she loves women. But the thing that she noticed was like at least half the women that were coming to her were also violent, at least as violent as the men. So she famously polled the first 100 women, and she found, I think 61 were as violent as the men they left. So straight away, she realized this isn't a gendered issue at all. This is a cyclical family issue, often learned in childhood, and I need to open a refuge for men. So as soon as she tried to open a refuge for men, all the people that were reaching into their pockets to help fund her, they disappeared, and it was replaced with, threats, bomb threats, death threats. She had a police escort, bomb squad had to go for a mail. She was harassed at every single public event she went to. Feminists picketed her, saying that she condoned male violence, and she was basically erased from the history books, had to leave the country, and she remains a shadow of the domestic violence industry, despite having set up the entire thing itself. And the refuge that she set up then became Refuge UK, which is still the oldest and largest domestic violence charity in the world. And they'd never talk about her, but you'll still find her name online. But Erin Pitsey, like all she did was say women can be violent too, and men deserve support, and then that was it, gone, cancelled.
Stepped out of party line and wasn't
Yeah,
allowed to.
yeah. And I was like, how could you ever accuse her of being a misogynist when she spent decades of her life saving women and girls with her bare, like literally with her hand, like so many would have died if it wasn't for her, and people say that she is.
And so, I mean, we're kind of seeing a through line here, both with your experience and the experience of so many others, that to step into the space of men's advocacy is not necessarily a welcome space at all. And that you've had to push uphill, it sounds like, in some sense, to even be where you are now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want any sympathy. I mean, I'm sort of serenaded with kind words of support and love and appreciation. I very rarely get anything that happened to Erin. I get the occasional message that's not very nice, but it's a very rare thing. And I 99% of the time, I'm getting messages of thanks, particularly from women and especially mothers of boys. So put your violin away. I don't need any sympathy, but it's hard. It's hard in a different way where you feel vilified and you are censored, and I am often shadow banned. Right? I don't think the backlash against me is explicit. I think there's a lot of people that basically keep me under surveillance and then report my content and make sure it's not very visible. That obviously happens quite often, but anything more explicit than that, no. But then I'm also very careful. I mean, I haven't given you my full name. You've not used it, so I'm still conscious of it, but it's certainly not as bad as what happened to Warren or Erin or anyone else.
And no violin for you, but just recognition of this. This seems to be a space that many people don't delve into, and then when you do, it's just doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be that sympathy there. You brought something up there that I didn't want to lose, which was you brought up domestic violence, and in terms of seeing things like aggressive acts amongst women not necessarily being wanted to be something that society wanted to hear or be or necessarily be exposed to. What does it what does support for men look like in terms of domestic violence?
I think is we don't know. There's so many questions that we just do not know. Like we have a violence against women strategy in the UK that puts a lot of money in funding and research, quite rightly, into understanding the unique ways in which domestic violence impacts women and the ways in which they need support. That strategy doesn't exist for men, although there is a bill actually in Parliament tomorrow that's trying to change that. Whether it'll be successful, I don't know. But that's for violence against men and boys. So in the UK currently, a man who's being abused by his wife or girlfriend is considered a victim of violence against women. So he is considered a woman as a male victim of abuse, which is so offensive and
Well, let me make
demeaning.
sure I understood that. In the UK, a man who is a victim of domestic abuse is categorized as a woman who has been a victim of domestic abuse.
Yes, a man who's welcome. This is like the identity sort of politics at its most extreme, and it gets worse than that in many ways. I mean, in terms of sexual violence, it's way worse. But yeah, if you're a man being abused in the UK, of which there are 1.5 million men at that every year, you're considered a victim of violence against women. So you're a male victim of violence against women, not a victim of violence by a woman, but a victim of violence against. You're basically a woman. And all this talk of, people being misgendered, I'm like, surely that is one of the most egregious examples of someone being invalidated and misgendered. And we're trying to change that. Like I said, there's a bill that I've been pushing heavily that's going to recognise male victims of not male victims of violence against women, male victims of violence. That hopefully will change. But to bring me back to your question, if that bill passes, the same effort and funding and research will go into understanding how domestic violence impacts men and boys. Not just domestic violence, but stalking, sexual violence, especially against boys. And then we'll also try to work out how do we support these men and boys? Like, do they need the same thing as women? Do they need something slightly different? What sort of services are adequate and required? But beyond that, we just don't know because no one's asking, and I don't think I'm qualified. Some people think they need shelters. Some people think they don't need shelters. Some people think they need them less than women. Well, what we do know is that there are virtually none for men. Maybe about 3 or 4% of all shelters in the UK will accept men. The vast majority for women. But there's a lot of question marks in the space, I'm afraid, Michael, and there's not much we can do about it other than be patient and ask for answers from politicians.
We can certainly explore the question marks because I mean, I was going through your Instagram page and I do quite often. I follow the things that you put out. And one of the things I noticed was that you broke down statistics quite well. It was fascinating to take a look at the difference in domestic violence. And one of the things that stood out to me was that you pointed out that there is something approximating parity if you look across the age span. Did I understand that correctly? So, for instance, looking at boys versus.
Oh, no, that's looking at domestic homicide.
Uh-huh.
Which, I mean, this is one of the tricks people use when I talk about domestic violence is that if you look at domestic violence as a whole, especially in America, is gender parity. We can argue about whether it's the same severity and perhaps it's more damages women in that way. But in terms of all domestic violence or partner violence in America, it's gender parity. And if we're going to be specific, there are actually more male victims than female. But when you tell people that, someone always comes out with, well, one woman's killed every 3 days or every 2 days, which is true. And the majority of domestic homicides are against women. That's not to say there aren't men killed. About 1 in 4 are men, which is still a significant minority. And that doesn't include people that end their lives as a result of abuse by suicide, which are mostly men. And if you include those, it's also gender parity. So if you look at all homicides and suicides related to domestic abuse, gender parity in America. But what you're talking about is, I talk about domestic homicide. People seem to think that's just male partners killing their female partners or vice versa, but it's actually all domestic homicides. So parents, siblings, grandparents, like it goes all different ways. And if you include all of that, it's very similar, very close to gender parity there. These are Australian statistics. And people say, well, what you don't realize, George, is that they're always trying to explain it away, and they've always got these different tricks to explain it away. But when you point that bit out, they say, "Well, this is just women defending themselves and killing their partner." And then you look at the stats and the breakdown, and the vast majority of males killed in domestic homicide are children by their parents. So I'm like, well, are you asking me to believe that parents are killing their children in self-defense? Is that what you're telling me? So there's like a long litany of excuses, some valid, mostly not, that try to diminish and wave away the various bits of evidence and data that are building up to show that men are abused in significant numbers by women, and they need help. Another one, they will say, well, it's men doing it to other men. And it's not men doing it to other men, it's women doing it to men. Like in the UK, like the violence in gay relationships is some of the lowest. Some of the lowest violence in gay relationships, and some of the highest, if not the highest, is in lesbian relationships. So it's not men doing it to other men. It's very complicated. And I'm really tired of having to constantly disentangle and confront all of these myths that are thrown your way to try and slow you down in your conversation. Because the ultimate truth is that it doesn't matter how many men there are being abused, like even if it's just one, he deserves help. Just as
Still
much
a
as any
human
woman.
being.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very interesting that the slowing down, as I heard you kind of describe the gay couples in domestic violence, let's say, or, I I think the classic rhetoric around it is usually the opposite of what you actually just described. I almost feel like that there's been another bit of rhetoric that's been pushed along the lines, but you're telling me it's actually the opposite of what people usually like depict.
Yeah, gay relationships between men and lesbian relationships between women, as a rough rule, the fewer the men in the relationship, the lower the violence. So a gay male relationship has the lowest violence. A lesbian women relationship has the highest. Obviously, that's a very crude formula, but it's certainly one that goes against our intuitive understanding of partner violence. And there's just, my point is, there's more to say. And the thing that annoys me about the domestic homicide is that is such a small percentage of the entire problem. Like the way we measure domestic homicide is per million couples. The way we measure domestic violence is per 10,000 couples. So you can see that thankfully it's only a tiny, tiny percentage of the problem, and it's the most extreme. And I don't know if you're familiar with males at the tails, but men are more widely distributed. So obviously the most violent behavior are men. But if you look at the norm, the medium, they were more or less the same. So it's frustrating how the conversation of domestic homicide dominates the discourse around domestic violence when it's actually, a tiny percentage of the entire pie. And if you look at the entire pie, like I said, it's the same. It's the same.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a step back to something you said earlier. You mentioned money, and I think in these kind of conversations, particularly when you get pushback on something like a different way or a more, would you say, integrated way of looking at data, and you get pushback, I get very curious and cautious at the same time. Are there does it feel like there are people who are that are protecting their financial interests in this? Yeah. Can you speak to that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Erin Pitsey, who, again, that hero, I mean, if any of you do anything from this podcast, please go and read about her story. Yeah. She's still alive. This woman is a national hero, and she's living on income support in a one-bed flat in an attic in London, living in poverty, more or less. And I'm like, that's not fair. I really want more people to know who she is. Anyway, the person that usurped her, Sandra Hawley, who's a dame, she's on record saying if we were to admit that male victims of violence are just as big as female victims, we would lose our funding. We would lose a significant amount of our funding. And she said that. And that's exactly true. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said it on record. And I understand, and that is probably true. If we were to realize that a significant minority of victims are male, then there will have to be, I imagine, some sharing of the pot. And it is, when I asked Erin, why are they doing this? Why are they spreading this lie of gendered violence? She'd have said one word: money. And she would know. And there's a huge amount of money in domestic violence, especially in America. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And they don't want to share it. Why would you? It makes total sense. but it's being hoarded at the expense of people's lives.
Seems interesting. It's along the lines of, if you want to know what if somebody's fighting for something or fighting against something, just look at the actions at the end of the day. And I'm not exactly sure what they're fighting for, but it almost seems like they're, in that sense, fighting against the idea of having that money spread about and actually being reallocated in a way that would be useful. The early advent or the early idea of equality and feminism being that it should be an equal distribution of those types of resources. But for some reason, we have this cultural pretense that that's not allowed, or we're not going to go in that direction.
Well, that's that's one of the best and worst things about the space I'm in, meaning men and boys advocacy, is because there's no money here and there's no promise of money anytime soon. Everyone in the space is authentic, being their authentic selves, because they're not here for the money, because there is no money. So we're still here knowing that this is going to cause me a significant amount of financial hardship, and I'm still here. Like after 5 years, I've lost significant amount of money doing what I do, and I'm going to keep on doing it for as long as possible. And I really hope, whether people agree or disagree with me or like me or hate me, at least people, I hope, can agree that I am my authentic self and this is who I haven't got some sort of hidden agenda. I'm not here to make money, because there was very little to be made. So I enjoy that. I mean, it's sad that there's no money here, but at the same time, it does draw in the best people, because we all know we're here for the right reasons.
There for authentic reasons, and no violin, I promised you. But do you mind if we step into a different space, because we were talking about domestic violence and domestic homicide, and I find myself very curious because the internet has really just terraformed reality. I think that's an understatement that goes beyond an understatement in some sense. But I've been curious over the last couple of years. I've been watching kind of this cultural phenomenon of the red pill movement, and I was wondering if for our viewers and for our listeners, if you could describe a little bit of what the red pill movement is, and kind of the pros and cons of this movement, what you've seen across the years.
I mean, it's changed significantly from my time. The red pill was originally a term, almost a pseudonym, for men's rights activists. So Cassie J, who made the documentary The Red Pill, was very much about that. She made a documentary where she started off as a feminist and she wanted to expose men's rights activists. And she found, like, having interviewed so many of them, she was like, they've actually got a point. And then the documentary basically ends with her leaving feminism and becoming an MRA. That was the red pill. More recently, especially since Andrew Tate, the red pill was sort of adopted a new, not necessarily a different meaning, because the red pill essentially is the idea of waking up. Like from the Matrix, you take the red pill, you wake up and you see reality for what it is. In its original intention by Cassie and MRAs in general, it just basically meant the idea that to be a man isn't all good in every single way. There are significant barriers and ways in which men and boys are hurt, which is true. I suppose I've taken that pill. A lot of us have, but the new one is more misogynistic and more about grifting, more about pickup artistry, more around just basically dominating women and seeing women as inferior. And that red pill is about seeing women for who they are, but the original red pill was not quite like that. So it's become a bit of a poison chalice. A lot of the original red pillars have moved away, and there was a whole litany of different coloured pills, not just a red one. But yes, it's very much changed from its original intention. Yeah.
It seems like a couple of things get conflated across the line. Something like men going their own way, MGTOW. You have the red pill movement as it was originally thought through. I see the parallels kind of, the early critiques of feminism of looking at it through the radical feminist lens of saying that makes up the total parts of the whole, if you will, and kind of the early days of the red pill movement where people were saying it kind of had that same tone. But what I'm hearing you say is it almost evolved into that which it was being criticized. Am I going too far with it? Yeah.
Well, I think it just got adopted by people that were just much more poorly intended than the original red pillars. And you're right that it's then been further conflated within the manosphere, which is a loose combination of very disparately linked groups, if you actually understand them. And broadly, in the manosphere, people consider men's rights activists, and I consider them as wanting to change the system. So Warren Farrell was probably the founder of that movement. He wanted to give fathers equal rights. He wanted to change family courts. He wanted to change the presumption of joint custody. He wanted to change the system, as do MRAs. And then you have the pickup artists, or the red pillars, the new red pillars, and they want to exploit the system. they're happy with the system and they want to exploit it. The Andrew Tates and so on and so forth. And then you have the MGTOWs, the men going their own way, who are basically have had enough, and to an extent the incels, and they want to leave the system. And that's the way I navigate it. And together they're the manosphere. But ultimately they haven't actually got much in common. Like men's rights activists absolutely despise Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate despises incels. And they just do not get along. Like pickup artists have nothing in common with me or men's rights activists. So like they're all grouped together and sort of given this scary title to create fear and misunderstanding and diversion. But I suppose they are linked in the common denominator. They're all very critical of feminism, but they're not the same beyond that. That's the only thing I can
common
think of.
thread.
Yeah, but other than that, they're really not the same at all.
You brought up incels there, and I was actually going to add it to my list earlier, but it kind of fell off there. Incel culture seems to be something that's a hot topic that people are talking about a lot today, but I never hear anything that seems particularly consistent in terms of how people discuss it. You know, what is an incel, and how are people discussing it in your spaces?
Incel stands for involuntary celibate. So it's men, mostly men, a few women, that struggle to date, especially have sex. And not just that, but also just struggle in general with making friends, finding work, hanging out with people, having a normal social life. Of course, sex is a central part of that, but it's a lot more than just sex. They're just the outcasts. They're socially awkward. There's a huge overrepresentation in autism within incel communities, about 30 times higher than within the general population, which is like huge.
30
that
times
helps
higher.
you understand. Yeah, so you're looking at these socially awkward men who spend a lot of time online, who are often radicalized into hating women. But it's a lot more than that. It's not the research I read, which is the only research in the world that's actually talked to incels, which is surprising. They find that it's not a terrorist threat, it's a mental health crisis. Like counter-terrorism isn't going to do anything. It's not the right approach. There needs to be mental health interventions because these men are not violent, and if they are violent, it's overwhelmingly towards themselves. Like suicidality is off the charts. I read one in 5 incels consider suicide every single day. That's how bad it is.
1 in 5 every day.
1 in 5 every day for the past 2 weeks. I think for the general population, I think about 5% of the general population considers suicide once a year. So this is 20% of incels every day. So I think that sort of shows who these people are, and they're in desperate need of help. They have extraordinarily high levels of anxiety and depression, loneliness. They're very reluctant to seek any sort of medical help. And the more and more we talk about them in the way we are, we're just pushing them further and further into the recesses of the online world, where people are just going to radicalize them further, and they're going to turn them into the misogynists that we talked about them about. But they're massively misunderstood. They're often seen as the alt-right, like white men, but in fact they're actually mostly centre-left, and they're also mostly incels of colour. So they're not what we think, and we've done a really poor job in talking about them. Like beyond Netflix series, no one seems to care, and we've been presented a very dramatic and unhelpful and counterproductive view of incels, and now everyone seems to be some sort of expert.
And by Netflix series, are we talking about adolescents?
Yeah.
Specifically?
My friend, yeah, yes.
Yeah.
My friend, I mean, it's impossible to not talk about it. My friend William Costello, who's the world's leading expert on incels, he was the one that found that there's an overrepresentation of incels of colour. So I think like 40% of incels consider themselves a person of colour. And when you consider their minority group, that is an overrepresentation. And he says whenever he talks to people about incels of colour, people are a lot more compassionate towards them. They're like, oh, these young black men, they're lonely, they're not having much success in dating, they can't find a job, they're stuck at home, they're dealing with loneliness and depression. Oh, this is very important. But it's only when he adds in the white bit, people are like, oh, gross. We hate those people. And it's so interesting how you can just change the skin colour of an incel, and he's found we're a lot more compassionate when it's a person of colour versus a white person.
So the demographics completely change the selection of empathy. It's absolutely, it's just like you take or add a characteristic and you change the entire tone.
Yeah, well, it's like education as well. Like the lowest, the group in the UK least likely to go to higher education is not just boys, but specifically white working class boys. And like also being white man is like you have a very high rate of suicide, even higher than a lot of like men of color. And whenever that data comes out, I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake! Like the stuff I say is already unpopular enough. I have to add in the white bit too. But yeah, white working class boys are bottom of the pile by a significant margin in education, and white men are probably one of two groups most likely to kill themselves, and that's even more unpopular than just men. Because I mean, God, to be a white man, it's even worse than to be a man for a lot of people.
Has that been part of what you've noticed from the start? Because I know when you mentioned living on the street, trying to raise money for women, you were getting a lot of pushback just based. You mentioned your race right off the
Yeah,
bat,
and
in
my
combination with your gender. Uh-huh.
and me being physically attractive, which was like a bit of a okay.
Oh, that
They
was
were
the
like,
compliment part. Uh-huh.
they were
Uh-huh.
like,
Mhm.
look at these two good-looking white men. I was like, oh, well, thanks very much. But it's I don't know. And the fact is, they were right. They're like, we don't.
Mm.
I have zero experience as a woman being abused. Zero. I don't know anything about it. But I'm here in good faith. I want to help. And what I do know is how to raise awareness and raise money. And I was like, maybe we can work together. Maybe you can bring your lived experience. We can bring our ability to reach audiences and raise money. And and they were like, no. So it did seem to be more about the color of our skin and our gender and how attractive we were. But I just don't know. Like I was quite young then. That was about 10 years ago, and I was just honestly trying my best. But that was the first little red flag that went up, and I was like, this isn't right. I'm here trying to do something good, and that still isn't enough for these people.
Mm. Still wasn't hitting the mark.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's impossible. I mean, like, it's just purity contest, and you're never going to win as a white guy. So, what are you going to do?
Mm. At the beginning of the conversation, you said that you're finding things that constantly blow your mind. What's something recently that's really stood out to you that maybe reframed some things for you?
And I worked out what percentage of rapists are women, which is, I've always wanted to do that because it's been very complicated. Because, I mean, it's so controversial. So, I mean, I'm happy to say it's very controversial, but you'll see memes online, you'll see a tweet, or you'll see it in like newspapers, you'll see it in the Office for National Statistics, you'll see it on the CDC. Things like 99%, 98% of rapists are men. And it's like, goodness, that's a huge problem. That really is gendered. And then you scroll down and you look at the definition of rape. Like, well, what do you consider rape? And it would be like the forced penetration of a penis into XYZ orifice. And you're like, well, women don't have penises. Only men have penises. So you've actually created a crime that only men can commit, and then you're acting shocked that only men are doing it. 99%. The 1% are women that are engaging in joint venture where they basically help a man rape another man, but directly, a woman cannot commit rape. In the UK, it's legally impossible for a woman to commit rape because she hasn't got a penis. That the way the law is written.
Under that definition.
Yeah. If you look at the law, what constitutes rape, it's the same thing. It's like the forced penetration of a penis into whatever. And that's what leads to these stats that are actually true, but they're very misleading. But more recently, the Centre for Disease Control have started collecting data on men who are forced to penetrate, which is like essentially the male equivalent of being raped. And they've also broken it down by perpetrator. So you can actually work out, if I take all of the instances of rape against women and men, and I break that down by perpetrator, and I take all the instances of men made to penetrate and break that down by perpetrator, put them all together, I can actually work out what percentage of rapists, using a gender neutral definition at least, are women and men. And I think it's about 65% are men. So still most of them, but certainly not 99%. It's about 2 in 3. And that was just like, what am I going to do with that? Well, that is such an unpopular stat, but I mean, the maths is there. I laid it all out for you. I've given you the sources. And it was about 65%. The same when I look at domestic violence stats, and again and again and again every year, CDC data again, 50-50. And I've done like posts where it just takes every single CDC survey ever done, presents them all side by side, and it's like, look, 50-50 every single time. And I look at that data and I'm like, that is just so unpopular. The hell am I supposed to do with that? But I mean, I put it online in a way. Who cares? And it's just shocking.
What's the response been? I know earlier you mentioned that even you've had some women reach out to you related to your content. I mean, what's the response to that kind of data?
I get loads. I mean, for that sort of stuff, I do get quite a bit of both. I had a woman recently message me, and she was like, "I started writing a really angry message to you, And then I was reading it back, and she was basically recounting stories of men that she knows that have been abused and women that she knows that have been abused. And she was like, actually, this is exactly what George is saying. She was like, both women and men have been abused in my life, and that's what he's saying. And then she like deleted the message and wrote another message to me, like saying, you've changed my mind. I really, really appreciate it. I started writing one message and I ended with another, and thank you. And I'm like, give yourself some fucking credit for that one. Like, most people do not make it that far.
For having the flexibility to make that change.
Yeah. But, I mean, I'm inspired by that in many ways, especially for a woman. Like, I think it's more difficult for women to come over that, especially women that have had experiences at the hands of men, like but poor, negative ones, of which there are far too many women in that camp, of course. But I'm always inspired by women that can overcome their own biases and see past their personal experiences to reveal the reality that men and women are abused at equal rates. And yeah, it's inspiring. I mean, obviously, then in the comments, people go through all the different excuses that I talked to you about. And women are doing it in self-defense, or it's not that bad, or it's men doing it to other men, or you made up the stats, or whatever. And it's just, you go through every single one, and there's always another below it. And yeah, so a mixed bag of responses.
No shortage of people on the internet that will give you a piece of their mind behind a keyboard. Certainly not.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
You know, I watched an interview you had recently with Dr. Susie Bennett, a male suicide researcher, and there was a point in, and I feel like I'm taking a clip out of context, and I certainly am, which was you were discussing, are we ever going to know the reasons, totally know the reasons behind male suicide? And it got me thinking a little bit because, you know, a lot of these conversations they happen on a global scale. But I'm thinking for our members and for people who, you know, watch our videos, they're therapists. They deal with the day-to-day nuance of the individual experience. And one, I wonder if you remember that comment, but two, I wonder, you know, do you feel that way today in this moment? Like that we'll never know.
I don't think we will ever know. That's the sad thing about suicide, is they leave so many unanswered questions. Like, if you spend any amount of time talking to bereaved families or loved ones, you realize a lot of them have no idea why the man in their life killed himself. And that's what's so tragic about it. A lot of men don't even know. And it's very frustrating that knowing that so few of the people close to that man can explain why he killed himself. You go online and then some know-it-all has all the answers. And it's the same one-word catchphrase, not just for that man, but for all men. And he did it because he's suffering from toxic masculinity. And I'm like, how dare you say that you have the answer to the very worst thing that's happened to this family, and they're struggling to understand why you did it, and you're coming along like some sort of armchair expert, insisting that you have the answer when you don't. Like, anyone who's asked that question who doesn't immediately say, I don't know, you don't know, and you probably will never know unless you sat down with that man, is lying to you. So we just don't know, but we do know what the associated circumstances are. We do know that about 1 in 5 suicides in America are linked to financial trouble or joblessness. We do know that about 20% of suicides in the UK are linked to family breakdown, child custody battles. We do know that about 10% of men who are being abused will consider suicide. But beyond that, we don't really know. So I've always found it frustrating that everyone wants to talk about male suicide now, which I very much welcome, but so few of us are willing to talk about the things that are causing men to take their lives, such as domestic violence. Like, the data is about between 6 and 11% of men being abused will consider suicide in their life. In the UK, I mentioned it, we have, in the UK we have about 1.5 million men being abused. In America, it's obviously more than that. If you just think about 10% of that are at risk to suicide, that's such an enormous number, and no one's talking about male victims of abuse, and yet everyone's talking about male suicide. So it's like, there's no point talking about male suicide if you're not willing to talk about the things that men are talking about themselves. So I've always found it frustrating how we tell men to talk and open up, but no one wants to ever talk about the things they're telling them, such as losing jobs or losing children. Like, a lot of fathers attempt and complete suicide when they lose their children in family courts, and I can totally understand that. And one of the ways I've had my mind change is learning that male suicide isn't primarily a mental health problem. Yes, it's many different problems combined, and most suicidal men don't consider themselves as having a mental health problem at all. They'll have like a child custody problem, or they're being abused, or they've lost their job, they're in debt. So that's a fundamental change. I think we need to all get on board and stop pathologizing suicide as some sort
Taking a
of
look at the external stressors.
yeah, and like it's this the combination and culmination of personal stresses that push men to seeing suicide as a way out. Like they've there's nothing they can do, and they see suicide as what I've seen called a rational solution-based outcome, which is a horribly cold way of putting it, but it also makes a lot of sense. Like the number one at-risk group to suicide in the UK are construction workers living in northern towns and cities, often because they work a job, they've trained their whole life to be working construction, they'll get to a certain age, maybe their back gives out, they can't retrain, they don't know what else to do, they have a family like relying on them, and they'll kill themselves. And I don't think that man has a mental health problem. I'm sure his issues are moderated by mental health, but the primary cause of that is he can't retrain, he's in debt, he's losing his job, he's in excruciating physical pain, and he sees suicide as a solution-based outcome, as I said. And the same for like father losing his child. Like I don't have children, but I imagine losing a child in a divorce, not to mention your wife or girlfriend, and maybe your house and half your money. I'm like, I can understand why a man would consider ending his life. Like Susie, who has spoken directly to more suicidal men than I would say anyone on the planet, she's always saying like she'll talk to suicidal men and they'll tell her all about their lives and what they've gone through, and she'll be like, I'm not surprised you don't want to be here anymore. Like, it's horrible to say, but I'm not surprised. And they're not mentally unwell, they're not suffering from some sort of chemical imbalance, they've just got, you know, all these different problems that I can't even begin to list for you, and they see suicide as a way out of that. And it sounds horrible to say, but I hope men in these positions find that validating, in the sense that what you're going through is not some sort of internalized problem where you're toxic or whatever else. Like what you're going through is very real, and you deserve so much more support and help than you're getting. And I'm sorry.
You know, you brought up the word of the day, toxic masculinity, and saying that, you know, some keyboard warrior might try and reduce the complexity of the human experience, in this case, a man's experience, down to this idea of something being situated in them, the idea of toxic masculinity. What are your thoughts on the term? You know, what kind of effect do you think this has on men, or our perspectives on maleness, masculinity?
Well, toxic masculinity as a phrase went through the same journey as the red pill, when it started off as a word used by the mythopoetic men's movement to basically describe a type of masculinity that's resulting from a lack of fatherhood or lack of a male presence. And it was used by basically a bunch of hippies to talk in good faith about the importance of male role models. And then it's been adopted. In 2015, in the wake of Me Too, it changed its meaning completely, a bit like the red pill, adopted by more nefarious people, and it's lost its utility altogether. Obviously, I hate it. I don't find it useful whatsoever. It's just another blanket assertion that vilifies men. Frankly, is falling out of favour these days, and it basically suggests that men die by suicide because they don't seek help because they're toxic. But then again, there's this things called data, and if you actually look at data, the study I've been looking at recently, it was in Manchester University, and they actually studied men who died by suicide, who completed suicide, middle-aged men, and they found that 91% of the men who died by suicide had actually sought help. So more than 9 in 10 men who died by suicide had actually sought help from health or mental health services, or police or whoever else, crisis support, and they still died by suicide. So I don't understand that. Saying men don't seek help is not true, because 9 in 10 of men who did die by suicide did seek help and still died by suicide. And of the men who died by suicide, of those who were assessed by a clinician, 80% of them were seen as low risk or no risk. So these are men that died. So these are men that died by suicide. 80% were seen as low risk or no risk, and yet we're still blaming the men. I'm like, he sought help, he was assessed, he was deemed, 8% of them were deemed no risk or low risk. That's the problem. Like his suicide is almost an inevitable conclusion to that. It's not surprising in many ways. So I'm sick of this finger pointing towards men, not just in suicide where we tell men to open up, but more broadly in health, where men need to go to the doctors more. Or when we talk about boys in education, boys need to try harder. We don't do that to anyone else. Like if we talk about a man who's assaulted on the street, or who did it? It was another man. And I'm like, who are you to have no sympathy for men and even boys, children? Who are you? Like, how are you the self-prescribed guardian of morality that you've painted yourselves as? You're just an asshole, basically. And we only ever want to talk about men's problems as a means of hitting them with a stick of some sort. And we want to basically contain all of their issues to some sort of internalized problem or a personal failing, rather than acknowledging the fact that he's subject to structural issues just like a woman is. Like the cause of male suicide are mostly structural, economic, political, financial. Like there's so many things. It's not in here. Like men's issues are not in here. They're out there, just like women's. And like we only ever say when a woman has a problem, we rightly say we need to change society. But when a man has a problem, we only ever seem to say a man needs to change himself. And that's the problem, I think.
Situated within him. I
Yeah.
often wonder, when we're telling men to talk about their feelings, we're going with the assumption that they have some, and yet there's the entire way of getting them to do that is flagellating in nature. It's unkind. It completely just denigrates them as them being the problem. Go fix it with somebody to do it, and not paying attention to the fact they might feel some type of way about being told that they're the problem, or that there's something wrong with them or defective that's pushing them into something like treatment. It's From my view, I mean, it's no wonder that many of these men don't necessarily stay in treatment.
Yeah.
The proportion of men who stay in treatment is at a dismal rate.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't understand how we can't at least have a conversation about how therapy and the psychological industry might be partly at fault for that. Like if so many men are seeking help and then killing themselves, like surely we have to have that conversation too. Like if I were to go back in time to my former feminist self, I'd always be talking about how a boardroom that is 80% male boardroom directors is going to often lead to a work environment that favors men. That is just a mundane thing. I think that's fair enough. But then if you look at the psychological industry, of course you're a therapist, you can speak about it a lot more than me, but 80% of therapists, 85% of therapist trainees are women. Like, could that not be the same in reverse? Could that not be leading to treatments, frameworks, intervention strategies that are more favorable to women? Maybe is that so outrageous to use the exact same like thought experiment, but in an area where women dominate? And might that explain why so many men do seek help and still kill themselves, or don't seek help at all? I just like, it's such a common sense thing to say. It shouldn't be controversial whatsoever. And I don't think female feminists and women in the psychological industry are doing it on purpose. I don't think they're doing it on purpose at all. They're just seeing things through the eyes of a woman, which is often usually different to that of a man. And it's happening inadvertently. So, yeah.
And it's certainly possible when we see it in, homogenous groupings, kind of an orthodox, popular framing of certain ideas can become kind of pernicious and pronounced, and then certain norms can express themselves in those groups. And definitely, I'd be the first clinician to admit that I've been in those settings where I've heard colleagues, many of whom I quite admired and quite liked on an individual basis, but kind of falling in line with this way of talking about men that's not particularly helpful. In fact, I would argue, from a therapist standpoint, that's something that needs to be worked through before you enter a room with a man. And I think I would probably see something similar if I were in a completely male-dominated space as well. Just as you said, the logic kind of assumes itself. I want to step back to something. You brought up education, and lately I've been trying to understand this notion from different parties around redshirting for boys, keeping boys back a year. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I just think it makes sense in theory, but I don't like the idea of it at all. So just to lay some groundwork, boys are behind every stage of education in more or less every single Western country. Like every single area, every single level, every single Western country, boys are behind, with a few small exceptions. It's a massive problem. It's not like 1 or 2 years, 1 or 2, so it's everywhere. And right from the bottom to top, early years right through to higher education and beyond, boys and young men are behind. There are so many people trying their best to work out why that is. There are lots of really interesting reasons. One of them is the idea that boys have delayed cognitive development to girls, of which there is some scientific evidence. And I do appreciate that is probably true. But the solution that's presented to that by people like Richard Reeves, I guess well intended, is that, we need to hold boys back, and boys will start school at 5 when they've had a bit more development cognitively. Girls can start at 4. We redshirt the boys. It comes from baseball or American football, I think. where like, a player's not quite ready to play for the team, he or she's redshirted, and that's what they want to do to boys. And I just don't. I get it. There is logic to it, but I don't think boys are going to catch up with girls if we're going to hold them back. Like that's just the complete opposite of what we should be doing. And there are far more compelling things we should be doing. I think a lot of it's similar to therapy. They have the exact same disparity of male to female in schools, where 80% of teachers are female. 1 in 4 schools in the UK have no male teachers in it whatsoever. So not a single male teacher in a quarter of primary schools in the UK. And like naturally, that's probably going to lead to learning environments, learning styles, and even grading that favors girls over boys. And there's evidence for that too. So there is lots of evidence, compelling evidence, that finds that girls are graded higher than boys of the same cognitive ability. And you'll look at exam results, and a boy and a girl doing the same, and you look at a teacher assessment of those same boys and girls, and the girls are doing significantly better. So you have objective measurement of cognitive ability, the exam, versus subjective teacher assessment, and that's where the gap is. So it looks like that is actually true, and that also makes sense. I don't think it's something they're doing on purpose. I just think male teachers are less likely to problematize a boy's bad behavior and less likely to mark them down. I mean, I relate to that significantly because I was a naughty boy, just in terms I was cheeky, I'd answer back, I wouldn't listen, I'd daydream. And I was considered a naughty boy, but a better way of describing me was a disengaged boy, bored boy, frustrated boy. And I wasn't listening, I wasn't stupid. And I got awful exam results and worse teacher assessments because I was acting up because I was bored. And I think there's a lot of boys that are just being failed by education, acting up in a way I did, getting awful grades and being considered stupid or naughty. And I know in America, worse, you get medicated. You get stuck on Adderall or something like that. And it's just, I don't understand it. So teacher grading bias seems to be a problem. Redshirting as well, sure. I think the teaching styles in school in general are dreadful for everyone, but particularly boys. The idea of like sitting down for 5 hours a day, quietly reading, is just not going to work. And boys do not want to do that. Girls don't want to do it either, but boys seem to be able to tolerate it a little bit better. There are obviously things like scholarships in higher education, scholarships and awards that are still overwhelmingly for girls and young women, despite women and young girls being ahead in every single ethnic and racial group and socioeconomic group. And yet the scholarships, gender scholarships, still go to them. And there's just loads and loads of reasons. Learning styles, teachers, disparity, more male teachers, cognitive delay in boys. But again, there's another big question mark. Like the greatest experts in the world in this area, they themselves, like Richard Reeves, he says, I don't know. I've asked the number 1 experts around and they don't actually know. These are just ideas. And the fact we don't know is itself a damning indictment of the problem because no one wants to find out. Like there was in America, there's a national coalition for education of women and girls. No such thing for men and boys, and there really ought to be, to ask these questions. So the answer isn't just hypothesized by people like me who don't really know what they're talking about, if I'm honest. And these questions need to be given to far more credible people than myself, because we don't know.
But it seems to me that what you've described is a potential mismatch between what boys need and what they're actually getting in an educational environment. That, I read an article recently of a school that was musing with the idea of removing recess, and I thought to myself, in what world is that going to be beneficial, boys or girls, to the students that are there after sitting for 8 hours a day, whatever it is, and then not being able to run around and play and get out some energy? I mean, how are those kids going to actually be successful in the classroom? And by and large, it seems to me that might disproportionately impact boys. But yeah.
And then it's getting burnt at both ends, because obviously more and more homework also being set. And like for children in primary school, we just should not be setting homework at all. It doesn't do anything. Like again, the data finds that the amount of homework has no impact in early years on sort of success later in life. The time after school in primary school needs to be spent outdoors, running around, climbing trees, getting your knees dirty, not doing more homework. So you're right, we're losing recess or break, but we're also losing the time after school too. And I know very rarely do we ever ask boys what do they want. Everyone again has their own opinion, but no one ever asked the boys. But they have asked the boys in the UK, the Lost Boys report, that is, by the Centre of Social Justice. And they asked boys, like, what do you like most about school? And the three answers they gave were: number one, nothing, which says it all. Number two was substitute teachers. So suggesting that they don't like their teachers, but they enjoy it when someone else comes in. The third thing was PE. So the only thing they actually do like is PE, physical exercise, and that's going. So is break or recess. And like, why are we surprised they're doing so badly? Like, what? Like, it's not surprising, and it's not something to blame them for. We should be taking responsibility ourselves for building a system that's just totally failed them. And then again, and more holistically, they're often coming from families without a father figure. 1 in 4 boys in America has no father at home, and they're deprived of male role models. They're taught these ideas of toxic masculinity from younger and younger ages. They're seen as some sort of rapist in waiting. They're exposed to these really ideological political worldviews that assumes that because they're male, they're born to be some sort of abuser. And then people go into school to brainwash these boys. And like, it's crazy. Like, everyone says educate our boys, but when they say that, they only ever mean educate them not to be a rapist. I'm like, well, just educate them full stop. So there's so much we're getting wrong. And again, I didn't know any of this for sure. But
It brings up a kind of a long-standing issue with, in particular in education. What is the hidden curriculum, which is not necessarily what's on the syllabus or actually explicitly what you're supposed to be teaching, but what are the implicit undertones of the education itself that are happening in the backdrop? You know, and I'm mindful of time because I know it's a little later across the pond, and I want to ask you one more thing, because you brought up economic disparities before, and you know, when you bring up economic disparities in terms of gender, we think, you know, my first thought is gender pay gap. You know, what are your thoughts on the gender pay gap? There seem to be two very explicit camps if you go online with people, and not a lot of people who want to discuss maybe some more of the nuanced intersection in between. More of it either totally exists, 80 cents to the dollar kind of conversation, or this other thing that says, oh, we've completely gotten this statistical data wrong, and you can normalize this and almost render it
gone.
Gone. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many different gaps, and then so many different causes of the different gaps. But the big gap, everyone says, you know, women earn 77 cents to the dollar a man earns. And what that is comparing the average woman to the average man. You're not controlling for like hours worked, job level experience, or even the area that man or woman works in. You'll be comparing like a female cook to a male brain surgeon. Obviously, they're not getting paid the same because one's a brain surgeon. And what that says is that men gravitate more to the higher paying jobs. And we can have a discussion on why that happens. But a male and female brain surgeon are paid the same. And men work more hours. A lot of that's tied to childhood. A lot of it because women take time off to raise children. And a lot of that's because fathers don't have any time, aren't given that time to take off. So yeah, the childcare penalty, men work longer hours, men work higher paid jobs, men work more overtime, men work more dangerous jobs. Like the amount of 4,500 men die every year from their job in America. That's about 90 to 95% of all workplace deaths, and they get paid more because they're working dangerous jobs. They're more likely to travel, more strenuous work. There's loads of reasons why men are paid more, and the industries that men gravitate towards are paid more, and they should be paid more. But even if you look at the median, so that the average man versus the average woman, in the UK, that's now changed, where now the average woman is now paid, the average young woman that is paid more than the average man. So even if you don't control for these things, and you just look at the flawed, uncontrolled pay gap, women are paid more. So there's no one's talking about that either. So we're actually in the midst now of the biggest legal battle, pay gap legal battle in the history of the world in the UK. At the center is Asda, which is, I guess, the equivalent of Walmart. And what they're saying is that they want shop floor workers are demanding to be paid the same as the warehouse workers. And that's been seen as like a proxy war between men and women in the pay gap. So mostly it's women on the shop floor, mostly it's men in a warehouse, and the women on the shop floor are saying we want to get paid the same as those in the warehouse, but they're not the same job. Like, warehouse work is more dangerous, warehouse work is more strenuous. You have to work longer, more unsociable hours. You have to travel out of town to get to it. The reason why they pay warehouse workers more is because if they didn't, no one would want to do it. So it's not fair because they're not the same jobs. If you're working on a shop floor, it certainly is difficult too, but you're working shorter hours, more sociable hours. It's easier to get to, and it's not as dangerous. It's not as strenuous physically. And like, I don't think they should get paid the same. And ironically, in the lawsuit, Asda were like, well, okay, anyone that wants to work in the warehouse on the shop floor, you can go and work in the warehouse, no problem, and we'll pay you what they get paid. And they said no. They said no, it's too loud, it's too dangerous, it's too cold, we don't like it, and if we'd have to get paid more to do that. And I'm like, how could you figured that? You figured out, like, anyway, it seems like they're actually going to win.
That the people on the shop floor are going to win.
Yeah, and they said they'd only work in a warehouse if they got paid more. But
more than what's being.
So they want to close the pay gap, but they're also acknowledging that to work in a warehouse does deserve more pay. The same thing happened within US soccer, where their women's soccer team, football team, I must say, they wanted to get paid the same as the men's because they won the World Cup. Congratulations! And they found out they would have got paid more had they had the men's pay contracts. And they had a big lawsuit and they won that, and they got like tens of millions of dollars in compensation. But what no one really knew is that they were offered the exact same deal as the men, and they didn't want it. They said, no thanks, we want the other deal. Both teams were offered two deals. One deal was pay to play, so you pay or win, you get paid. That's it, nothing else to it. That's the one the men went with. The women had the second deal where you do pay and you do get paid. You get paid if you play too, but less. But you also get loads of perks. You get like healthcare, dental care, childcare leave. A certain amount of members of the team get a base salary. And there was some sort of trophy bonus. There was some sort of tour bonus. There was loads of different things on top of pay to play. The women chose that. The men just wanted the money, and the women wanted all the perks. Ironically, had the women chose the men's deal and had the men chose the women's deal, they both would have gotten paid more. But the point is, they made the choice. They made the wrong one in hindsight, and that's part of being an adult, living by the consequences of your decisions. But that wasn't good enough for US women's soccer. They wanted the best of both worlds, and they did get best of both worlds, and they got offered the same deal as the people. They were like, right, stop the case. We're going to give you the exact same deal as the men. Do you want that? And they were like, no, because they didn't want to give up all of the perks. They were like, we want the perks and the men's deal. And they were like, you can't have your cake and eat it. Like, you can't have it both ways. We're going to give you the men's deal if you want it. And they said no. And they sued them instead, and they won. And it's just... and people hold that up as some sort of discrimination against women, when in fact it's the opposite. It's very much a matter of having cake and eating it too. And no one ever talked about that. And it was crazy. It was so, and then ironically, the women's football team got paid so much that they actually got paid more than whoever won the World Cup. And it's just, this is the world I live in. It doesn't make any sense. And like, somehow I'm the one that's painted as a villain, when it feels like the people at the women's football team, they feel like the real villain. And then anyone that criticizes them is accused of being the baddie. But
I mean, George, yeah. I mean, I had you on today hoping that we'd solve it all in an hour, but I think I might have undersold the complexity of the issue here. And but I so appreciate what you're doing. I think you already know that you're making an impact, but where do you think people need to start to turn their attention now? Is there a specific area that you think would start to kind of move this conversation along?
I mean, male suicide has got to be the more priority. Not just for men and boys, but for society in general. When you consider how many men are dying young and how many men are dying by suicide, it's the number one risk to my life and your life. And it'll be the number one risk to our lives until we're 50, and probably beyond that. That is such a massive problem. And the way we see and understand male suicide, as we discussed earlier, is fundamentally flawed. And we know it's flawed because although we're talking about it more and more, and I'm thankful we are, we've just had the worst year yet for male suicide, the worst year this century for male suicide in the UK. So for all of our talk and kind words, it's actually not getting better. It's getting worse still. So a fundamental shift is needed in how we talk about suicide, particularly in men, that moves outside of this biomedical model of suicidal pain that assumes it's all in here, some sort of chemical imbalance to be corrected through medication of some sort, and to start to see it like we described, where it's not men who are mentally unwell, it's men who are put under extreme stress and pressure, immiserated by many different issues, so many discussed, many more I can't even begin to comprehend, that are pushing men to suicide as some sort of no way out outcome. And they're not mentally unwell. The majority of them are not mentally unwell at all. They're just doing what they think is the only thing they have left to do, and like they've got no choice. So a change in the way we see male suicide is a great way of seeing all the other different issues that I talk about we don't want to talk about domestic violence, sure, but men who die by suicide as a result of abuse, I think we can talk about men who are losing their jobs and die by suicide, men who are losing children and die by suicide. It's a really important faucet through which so many issues can be accessed and talked about in a way that isn't quite as controversial as talking about them directly. So I would say, if one thing can change, or if I could start one conversation, it would be about changing our approach and understanding of suicide in men in a way that's a bit more holistic and not based on stupid catchphrases like toxic masculinity and whatever else, and have a bit more compassion for these men that are living miserable lives and deserve help.
Well, I think you are contributing to that conversation. How can people find you? How can they support you?
Well, thank you very much. Mostly on Instagram still. I'm moving away from Instagram, but Instagram is still the main port of call. And it's TheTinMen, TheTinmen. And then from there, there's Twitter and Reddit and LinkedIn, YouTube and whatever else. But TheTinMen, all one word, on Instagram.
Thank you so much, George. Just know you always have support here at CTA, and we really appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah,
Your mission's an important one.
Well, I've enjoyed learning a lot about you. I feel like there's a lot of overlapping principles, and I'd love to stay in touch and do another episode. And thank you.
More conversations to come. Thank you so much,
Hope
George.
so. Bye-bye.
Take care.